Good morning, everyone. In a few moments, we'll start today's webinar for slot management, airport slot management with the participation of experts of ACI. We will allow a few more seconds before we start. Here we go. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for participating in this webinar, elaborated by ACI-LAC together with ACI World. We will talk about airport slots. This is an introductory topic, but we believe it's important for the airports in the region so they know how this concept and methodology works for allocating slots. Before this, I want to give the floor to Rafael Echevarne, our General Director, for welcome words. Thank you very much, Francisco. Welcome to everyone. I will say a few words in Spanish, then in English. It's a true pleasure that you have decided to join this webinar. I see we have 77 people on board, and this is increasing. One very important topic for our region, well, globally, actually, but especially more and more in our region. And we thought it was important to have a webinar as an introduction to this topic, but not because we believe it's something new in the region, but due to the recent changes in the last few years, we believe it's important to hold this webinar as an introduction so that the experts of ACI World, Sophie and Franco, can really update you with the latest development in the slots world. I will not abuse your time anymore. I'm going to do it in English now, and I will say it in Spanish.
So welcome, everyone. I can see that we already have 87 persons joining this webinar. I was just basically saying in Spanish that we are very pleased to have so many of you joining on this very important topic, not only important in our region, but worldwide. Now, in our region, this topic is becoming increasingly important, and so we wanted to have this webinar as a way of introduction, but not because we don't think that you may not know about the topic, but because of the fact that there have been important developments over the last few years, and we want to ensure that we all are on the same, on the same wavelength, let's say, on this very important topic. So we are very happy to have with us our colleagues from ACI World in Montreal, Sophie and Franco. I don't know where Franco is today because he's all over the world. But anyway, he is one of the experts in ACI on this very topic. So I will stop here. Thank you to all of you for joining on this important webinar. And I will just go back to let Francisco continue with the hosting.
Thank you very much, Rafael. As we mentioned before, the presenters today will be Sophie Gebel, Director of Slots Infrastructure of ACI World, and Franco Saltor, Manager for Policy Analysis with Slots ACI World. He's Argentinian and has lots of experience and knows the region really well. Before starting, I want to remind you that, like in all our previous ACI-LAC seminars, we have simultaneous interpretation. Please choose your channel of preference, and the menu you will find in the lower part in the globe icon down below. You can choose either Spanish or English. We always recommend that you mute original audio so you won't hear the overlap of two voices, presenter and interpreter. Without any further ado, well, I want to tell you that after the presentation, we'll have a brief session of Q&A. We will not be using the chat, neither the Q&A or Zoom. Actually, we would thank you that you send your questions to this address you see on the screen, info@acilac.aero, and as much as possible, we will be sharing your questions with the presenters at the end of this meeting. If not possible, because we don't have enough time, as much as possible, we'll try to answer them by email in the next few days. So without any further ado, I give the floor to Franco, who will start this webinar. Go ahead, Franco. Thank you very much, Francisco. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. We will start with this webinar of ACI-LAC and ACI World about the introduction for the coordination of airport slots. Francisco, thank you. And the world legal norms that regulate the process of airport coordination tend to be based on this document we can see here that is called Worldwide Airport Slot Guidelines, or the World Directives on Airport Slots. These guides were originally created in the decade of the 70s by the airlines, and then they were developed later on by the airlines. Until recently, this document was called Worldwide Sport Slot Guidelines, WASG, the acronym in English. Even though WASG recommended how to manage airport infrastructure, the truth is airports were not involved in the development of these guides. Taking into consideration the clear direct impact that a slot policy has on an airport, the airport operators wanted to be more involved. This is why after hard work and efforts from the airport community, in 2016, airports were included for the first time in order to hold a strategic review of these guides or directives. This strategic review, we did an assessment of different aspects of the coordination process for these guides. And some of these aspects or points were improved. And then after this experience, the airports wanted to continue being involved permanently in the development of these guides and discussions about slots. This is why in 2019, the organism in charge of managing and publishing WASG was finally reformed. Now this organism is called Worldwide Airport Slot. It's an organism that is in charge of publishing and making changes on the guides. And it's composed by an identical number of airport operators, airlines, and coordinators, 7 and 7. This was a great advance for the airports, who so far had been excluded from the discussions about slots for more than 40 years. So then also the name of the guides or directives that used to be called WASG, now they're called Worldwide Airport Slot Guidelines. The word airport was added here, and the role of the airports was recognized in this process. Francisco. First of all, so we can understand this topic of airport coordination or coordination of slots, it's very important to know what a slot is. But before we can answer this question, first of all, we need to explain that the guides categorize airports in 3 levels in view of the degree of existing congestion. So we have the airports here, so we can see on the slide, level 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 airports are those where the capacity of the infrastructure is enough to satisfy the demand of the airlines. And most of the airports in the world are within this level 1 category. Then we have airports level 2 These airports level 2 are those where there is a certain degree of congestion during some specific periods of time, during the day, the week, or the season, maybe. And through voluntary adjustments of itineraries of the airlines, we can prevent that the capacity of the airport is exceeded, so we can prevent congestion. These airports are called level 2 airports. And there's a whole process that it's applied to them. It's called airport facilitation. And then we have level 3 airports. Level 3 airports, we call them coordinated airports. These are the most congested airports, and they're categorized, or their characteristics are because the infrastructure demands exceed their capacity. In the world, we have around 200 airports, level 3. The taking into consideration that we have so many airports in the whole world, well, this is just a small fraction and not so big. Nonetheless, a bit more than half of all the air routes in the world are operated in these airports. So it's the effect that these processes on level 3 have. I said that these types of airports are also called coordinated airports because this is where we apply airport coordination process. And these types of airports, well, here we implement coordination, airport coordination, usually in the following cases. Well, first of all, when an airport cannot add more capacity. This could be, for instance, when the airport is surrounded by the city, thereby it cannot have more space to expand. Or, on the other hand, this process can be applied when the airport needs to maximize the efficient use of its infrastructure before adding new capacity or more capacity. We all know how complex, how complicated and expensive it can be to expand capacities. So in many cases, it turns out we have very high costs and environmentally, it's also difficult to maximize infrastructure before we can expand. Now, with this brief overview about how the airports are divided or split in different levels, I believe now we can provide an answer to this fundamental question on what airport slots are. Basically, an airport slot is a determined time frame or a determined schedule on a specific day in which an aircraft operator lands or takes off in a programmed manner in a level 3 airport. As I said before, in the coordinated airports or level 3 airports, this is where we apply airport coordination. Thereby, the slots concept is only applicable to level 3 airports. Well, now, we need to distinguish the airport slots, for instance, from aeronautical slots. They're different things, no matter they seem very similar. Aeronautical slots or ATC slots, we can say aeronautical slot is a tool that is used short-term to manage the flow of air traffic. And it's based mostly in the time frames that will be operated during the operation itself. Meanwhile, airport slots, on the other hand, are a tool for planning more at long term, which is distant not only to manage airflow, but it's destined to manage the capacity of the airport and based on the program times for landing or taking off. Besides this, who assigns these lots are different entities. Aeronautical slots are assigned by the service provider of air navigation. Meanwhile, the airport slots are assigned by what we call a coordinator. Then we need to differentiate what we call the airport coordination process from the approval flight process. And this is done by some aeronautical authorities, and it's fairly common in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. These are different processes, and the flight approval process is when the airlines need, in order to operate a flight, they need to comply with many administrative requirements that are established by the norms. Now, if and when we have this flight approval process, and sometimes it's confused because this approval process for flights requires that beforehand, or sometimes in parallel, it's checked with other requirements that the airline obtains from the airport operator, the airport feasibility, that they provide the okay, that they can operate at a determined schedule. But the point is that these processes are two different processes. Airport coordination tends to manage airport capacity. And in this framework, slots allocation is addressed. Meanwhile, in the approval process for flights, the main objective is to verify that the administrative requirements are being complied or met in order to approve the flight. This can be, for instance, that the insurance is up to date, that they have the routes and the framework of the concession, that the airline is working according to their air services. These are different matters. Now, it could happen that in some cases, another point before this that is important, the flight approval process, if it's established, it can be applied to level 1, 2, and 3 airports. Meanwhile, airport coordination process is only applied to level 3 airports. Nonetheless, it's possible that they coexist, that there's a state that has an airport coordination process, and on the other hand, separately, they have a flight approval process. When this happens, a possible solution in order to address this is that the airlines must obtain the slots following the rules of airport coordination. And then if it's necessary, because of the norms, they should be approved by aeronautical authorities before the season starts.
Good morning, everyone. So my apologies. I will do this part in English as I do not speak Spanish, unfortunately. So before we go into the details of how slot allocation works, we just want to say a few words on airport capacity. So as we saw in the introduction, coordination is introduced when the level of demand significantly exceeds the capacity of the infrastructure. So many airports that we speak with have questions as to how this works in practice. So of course, there's many signs when an airport becomes congested, which varies depending on the system that causes that's causing the issue. So you see here in the table some examples of infrastructure capacity. So maybe there's frequent runway or gate delays. Maybe there are very long waiting times to pass security or customs. Maybe there's not enough check-in counters during peak hours. So passengers again have to wait for a very long time. So of course, all airports have more challenging days, so bad days, especially if there's bad weather or staff shortages. But what we're talking about here is systematic congestion, where even if the sky is blue, everyone is where they need to be, most days are problematic, even if there's no unusual or unexpected event. So people are generally where they need to be, the weather is good, but you still have a huge lineup to pass the security checkpoint, or planes land on time, and on a good day, the airline needs to wait for 20-30 minutes or whatnot for a gate. So this is when the congestion issue starts to become systematic and not just a result of, again, a bad day. So when this starts to happen, if this is not already taking place, airports need to start looking at their capacity in a more structured manner than might have previously been the case. So there needs to be analysis on the capacity of the infrastructure itself, and analysis on the operational capacity. So of course, airport capacity is a combination of both. And on the day of operation, actual capacity varies. So to effectively manage congestion through slots, the airport or the other body responsible for making the capacity declaration needs to make assumptions. For example, based on the prevailing wind direction, which usually affects the capacity of the runway, or based on the number of security lines that will be open, which will impact passenger throughput, which can be processed within the service standards. So for example, if you have 10 security lines, maybe your assumption is that 8 or 9 are open, and with that, you're able to process a certain number of passengers within 5-10 minutes, whatever the service standard that you determine is. So based on this analysis, the capacity parameters, which will be used for the slot coordination process, will be established. And these are essentially limits on the number of movements or the number of passengers that can be processed in a given time period. Now, a question that is often raised, especially by airports, is, well, by putting these limits, we limit the number of flights that we can have, and maybe on a good day we would be able to process a bit more. And while that is true, this is where the assumptions need to be made realistically about how much. Most of the time, say 95% of the time, the capacity or the flights can be processed within these limits without delays. So this is an analysis that will take place before we start implementing slot coordination. Next slide. Francisco, next slide. Thank you.
Well, I will continue. Thank you very much, Sophie. Well, now we will continue with the fundamental principles of the coordination process of airport slots. The truth is, this process has many stages and lots of details, but we will center ourselves for the time being on these fundamental principles. We have identified 3 fundamental principles: historical principles, the rule, 80-20 rule, and the use it or lose it. And then we have the transparency neutrality principle, and then the global consistency principle. We will start with the principle of historical principles, the 80-20 rule, by saying, well, the historical principles and the 80-20 rule are intimately linked. Before proceeding to explain this, I think it's necessary to explain that the airport that during the airport coordination process, we split the operational year in two seasons, winter and summer, that are more related with the dates in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, once we have this detail, now we can explain in a generic manner the principle of historical precedence. And this basically means that if an airline used its slots during a winter season, maybe at least in 80% of the time, that means that that airline during winter will have the possibility to have a priority for them to get the same slots assigned as the previous season or year. These historical slots are characterized because they don't expire. Once they have been awarded, it's not possible to take them away from the airlines unless they do something wrong or they use the slots incorrectly. Now, historical slots provide some benefits to airports. For instance, they provide some stability and predictability or for future operations, but there are some inconveniences and problems. It could be, for instance, that in view of the historical slots, maybe some requests from other airlines are blocked that maybe could use the airport capacity more efficiently. Or also, it could be possible that in view of the historical slots, we block requests from other airlines that pretend to operate a route that is more in agreement with the strategic long-term objectives of the airport, more convenient, let's say. So it turns out that in the airports, due to these reasons, it's not possible to take away the slots, historical aspects. So they have a big influence on how their capacity is used. Throughout the pandemic, we talked a lot about this 80-20 rule, the utilization of the slots. So here, maybe I will take a couple of minutes to explain why we have this rule. Basically, airports turn into level 3 because the airlines want to operate beyond their airport capacity. When the slots are allocated, some airlines see that they cannot operate at the moments they wanted to operate. So depending on the flexibility of their itineraries, maybe some airlines cannot operate at all. So in this context, since part of the demand could not be satisfied, the historicals must be balanced with a minimum requirement for the utilization of the airport capacity. So this will not, so this capacity will be fully utilized. This is economically important for the airport because they will have no income if the slots are not operated. On the other hand, it involves the environment because before considering expanding an airport, well, first we should try to maximize the efficient use of existing infrastructure. This principle of historical presence and 80-20 rule is one of the characteristics that differentiates level 2 airports from level 3 airports. Level 2 airports follow a similar calendar to those of level 3, but those in level 2 have no historicals, neither minimum requirements for using capacities. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time today to address more at length the level 2 airports, but please don't doubt and get in touch with us if you have any question in this regard. Now we go on to the next principle that we identified as fundamental during the coordination process of airport slots, which is transparency and neutrality. This means that even though it seems logical, the airport coordination process must be guided by transparency and neutrality. This means that the slots coordinator, the one that awards slots, should not favor a determined airline when they assign slots beyond the preference criteria that the process itself has. And on this slide, I would like to make a point, a clarification here in regard to the part that specifies non-discriminatory by a slot coordinator acting independently. It turns out that this part of a slot coordinator acting independently in the European Union, coordinators are rights subject or legal subjects independent of any other subject intervening in the process. This is because it's a requirement established in the European regulations. Global guides also suggest this, but we need to take into account that in the rest of the world, besides Europe, that we have coordinators that are subject to independent legal aspects. Is not the most used model. In Latin America and the Caribbean, this independent coordinators model does not exist. 70% of the level 3 airports are coordinated by the civil aviation authorities and the other 30% by the airport operators themselves. Last, the last fundamental principle that we can emphasize is global consistency. Taking into account that aviation is a global industry, the fact that all congested airports should follow the same calendar is very useful. It's also important to facilitate planning. Having said this, it's also recognized, even in ICAO, that these are guides or best practices that some states or regions adopt. They can adopt these regulations with some variations in view of their needs and local circumstances. And there are many examples of this. So once again, if you have any question or you're interested, please feel free to get in touch with us. Here, what we have is a calendar of activities, a time frame with the different steps or stages that the coordination of slots has. As Sophie mentioned in the declaration of capacities that she explained, this is one of the first steps in the process for airport coordination. Here, we see a series of stages. I cannot explain them in detail, but I will tell you in a macro way. I will give you a brief overview on how this process works. So first of all, I need to point out that the airport coordination process starts around 6 months before the start of the season. Later on, or in a parallel manner, once the capacity aspects are established, as Sophie mentioned, the coordinator, what they do is they share with the airlines a list with the historicals, if they have it, once that the airlines know what slots they can classify as historicals, and the coordinator knows what is the maximum declared capacity in his airport. Once this happens, the airlines, they do their initial requests of slots. What what the airlines want to operate in the forthcoming season. And then the coordinator proceeds to allocate the slots following the priority criteria that are established in the ICAO guides. If the declared capacity is enough to satisfy the slots requirements of the airlines, the coordinator just assigns slots as requested. Meanwhile, if what was requested exceeds the airport capacity, the coordinator will offer alternative slots to those that don't have a priority if there are alternative slots to be offered if they are available. Well, once this work is done by the coordinator, what the coordinator will do, he will send a message to every airline informing about the result of the initial allocation for those slots that have been assigned to each airline. Once this is done, the airlines analyze the slots they received, and then they analyze whether these slots will satisfy their needs or their planification. And this is the point in time that the airlines have to try to improve their portfolio. And they can do this by asking for more slots or trying to improve on what they have, or they can try to negotiate to interchange slots with other airlines. In fact, in the calendar, in this time frame, we see there's a stage that we call Slots Conference. Basically, it's a forum organized particularly to try to facilitate these types of discussions and activities in order to try to improve the slots portfolio that the airlines have. Around 2.5 months before the start of the season, the airlines must make the decision in regard to what slots will remain and those that will not operate. Well, and those that they will not operate, they should return them to the coordinator so he can reassign these slots for those that can use them. And here we also see in this calendar that there's a stage we call historical base or basis. This is the last activity before the end of the season, and basically it consists that we create a database that continues all the slots that the airlines have at that point in time. And on these databases, the airlines can obtain historical aspects or information, and they can see whether they have operated their slots correctly, historically speaking. Once the season starts, the coordinator will be in charge of supervising or monitor that the slots are operated according to this 80%, 80-20 rule, or the coordinators will also be in charge to ensure that the slots are operated correctly in the proper time frame or together with the airline coordinated by the coordinator.
Thank you, Franco. So we realized that there are many steps in slot coordination, but we hope that the last few slides gave you a good overview of what to expect in a level 3 airport. So as we mentioned in the beginning, airports have only been involved in the governance of the guidelines since 2019, so right before the pandemic. So most of the work in the past years, since airports have joined the governance of the guidelines, has been focused on managing the impacts of COVID-19. That being said, the guidelines still have many points which date back to when the global slot process was developed by the airlines only, and again, which have not really been reformed in depth since the 1970s, and which are not necessarily responsive to the interests of the airport operators, and very importantly, to the interest of consumers. So in 2021, ACI World organized slot policy forums where more than 160 airports and organization representatives engaged in discussions on a series of improvements which could be made to the guidelines to better reflect the interest of consumers, taking into account the interest of airlines and airports. So here we left a link for anyone interested in accessing this document if you want to have a look. And if you have any questions on the reforms that the airport community will be pushing for in the next couple of years, we would be happy to provide further details. So that covers our presentation today. Francisco, do you want to conclude?
Thank you very much, Sophie and Franco, for your presentation today. As we mentioned at the beginning, we invite you to send your questions to the email address we provided as much as possible. We will check these questions, but if we can't answer all of them, we would resend these questions to the presenters so they can answer you by email on the next few days. info@aci.lac. We have a couple of questions we have received, and we would like to transmit these questions to our presenters. The first question is fairly general, and what are the benefits for you and possible drawbacks for the airports in level 3?
Thank you, Francisco. So what we might say about that is that once an airport becomes congested, managing the congestion becomes a necessity to maintain safe, punctual, and reliable operations. So in that sense, if an airport is congested, there's not really a choice to do something about it, but rather it becomes a necessity. So if flights are continually scheduled above the limits of the airport's infrastructure, whether on the runway, on the apron, or in the terminal, it will create delays for airlines, for the passengers, and for all other stakeholders in the airport ecosystem, so whether ground handling or any of the services at the airport. So, and that will result in maybe air traffic control delays, waiting for gates, or again facing long queues, either at immigration or security checkpoint or any of the terminal processes. So that would ultimately, of course, greatly impact the experience of the passengers, and ultimately, especially in the case of something like runway delays, it would affect the safety of operations. So again, in this sense, when the demand systematically exceeds capacity, managing the congestion becomes the only reasonable choice. So the main benefit of establishing an airport as level 3 is that there will no longer be unacceptable systematic delays. Now, in terms of drawbacks, and you can find further information on this in the ACI World Slot Policy Forum proceedings that we mentioned at the end of our presentation. There's the fact that the guidelines were developed in the 70s, and that the aviation industry has experienced many fundamental changes since then. So the guidelines need to be modernized to optimize benefits for consumers. So while the guidelines were primarily developed to maximize benefits for already established airlines, there's several measures that can be considered to enhance competition, increase connectivity, and optimize the use of infrastructure. And these are all drawbacks to the guidelines that will be looked at by the global airport slot community in the next couple of years. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you, Sophie. I don't know, Franco, if you want to add anything more. If not, we go on to the next question. I think not. I think Sophie responded fairly well. Thank you. The next question is, what are the ghost flights and what implications or drawbacks could they have? Well, I will answer this, Sophie, if you agree. Well, ghost flights, well, maybe we should call them better, flights with low occupation levels that the airlines decide just to keep their historical presence on the slot series. There was a lot of noise on this topic or point in the past, but to clarify, airlines are not forced to operate these ghost flights. And if some of these ghost flights are operated, it's because the airline adopted a commercial decision and a strategic decision to operate an empty or an almost empty flight in order to protect their slot portfolio, in order to prevent they have to return these slots to the slot pool, to the slots that will become available. So basically, these types of actions impede, it's logical, the reallocation of slots to other possible competitors. And this also affects and undermines the efficiency itself of the airport. And at the end, it generates effects that are negative for the environment. The truth is, we don't support these types of ghost flights. But what we believe is that slots should be reallocated or reassigned to airlines that have the possibility to use these slots in order to satisfy their demand. Thank you, Franco. Sophie, would you like to add something else?
No, thank you. I think Franco answered the question. Thank you.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much, Franco and Sophie, for your time today. We don't have any more time for more questions. If we receive more questions to our email address, please, we will send them to both Sophie and Franco. If you have any questions that did not come up at this point in time, if you have any doubts or questions on slides, please send them to us, to the info@aci.lac.com together for Rafael, Carla, or myself. Rafael, if you're online, if you want to say some closing words, just to remind you that we're available for you for any webinar, any topic you would like to discuss. We will try to look for the experts we have in ACI and the different airports in order to provide you with more information on the topic or point that you would like to know more about. Also, any doubts you have, any clarifications you need in regard to this or other topics, please don't doubt to get in touch with us. Without any further ado, I want to thank Franco and Sophie for their time today. And we are at your service. For any doubts, please also send us your questions to the address I mentioned. Thanks to everyone. May you have a great day. Thank you.